You say, I can't do tonight, I need to rest. And suddenly the temperature changes. One person goes cold. Another sends message after message. Another turns the evening into a public emotional event. Another starts bargaining, looks for a way around your answer, and then loses interest when your answer stays no. Every reaction can hurt in a similar way. You may feel punished for having a need. You may start wondering, is this person selfish? Is this manipulation? Is this a personality disorder? Am I missing something? So here's a paradox. The same visible protest may have different possible functions, and any function remains a hypothesis until a repeated pattern and fuller context support it. If we collapse all of it into one label, we may feel certain, but we won't necessarily understand what we are seeing. So I want to give you a safer and more useful way to think, not a way to diagnose the person across the table, a way to separate what you can observe from what you can only infer, and then make relationship decisions without pretending you can see inside another person's mind. The same behavior can occur for different reasons, and a single behavior cannot establish any personality disorder diagnosis. Let me point that out again. A reaction can look selfish, it can be painful, it can even be coercive, but the visible reaction doesn't tell you by itself what psychological job that reaction may be doing. The framework is simple: behavior, possible function, repeated pattern, and consequence. Behavior means what happened? You said no, the other person insulted you, pleaded for contact, intensified the emotional display, or bargained, or withdrew, or accepted your limit. That's the observable layer. The next one is possible function. Possible function means what might the response have been trying to obtain or prevent? Maybe the person was trying to restore a threatened sense of specialness. Maybe the person was trying to stop a terrifying feeling of rejection. Maybe the person was trying to recover attention. Maybe the person was trying to regain access to a goal. Or maybe the person was simply disappointed and handling that disappointment badly. But notice the word possible. You didn't observe the function. You inferred the function. It's very important to recognize the difference between implication and inference. Implication is the meaning the other person communicated. Inference, or trying to communicate, inference is the meaning you determined from what you observed. So there's behavior and possible function. The next one is repeated pattern. Repeated pattern means what happens across time and situations. Does the same cycle return with friends, partners, family, and coworkers? Does it appear only during one stressful week, or does it keep organizing relationships? What I mean by this is, does the pattern organize your relationship structure? The next one is consequence. Consequence means what does the response do to you, to agreements, to trust, to repair, and to safety? What you observe isn't the same as the function you infer. And the inferred and an inferred function isn't a diagnosis. In this framework, the same visible protest may serve different possible functions, but any function remains a hypothesis until a repeated pattern and fuller context support it. That distinction is very important because it protects accuracy, but it also protects you. You don't need certainty about another person's inner world before you take repeated harm seriously. Self-centered behavior by itself isn't enough to establish a personality disorder. A diagnosis requires more than one isolated behavior. A qualified clinician has to look for an enduring pattern across situations, the distress or harm it causes, the person's context, and other possible explanations. In other words, If you're not a licensed diagnostician, do not diagnose. Personality disorders also vary from person to person, and more than one can be present at the same time. A label alone doesn't reveal a specific motive, inner experience, or behavior. In other words, a label doesn't give you a mind reading device, and one bad evening doesn't give you a label. Self centered conduct can have many possible explanations, including situational stress, substance effects, or another mental health condition. So, a qualified clinician must consider alternatives rather than assume one explanation. A fifth person may simply be disappointed or may be acting under stress, intoxication, or other situational influences. Importantly, none of these possibilities removes responsibility for harmful conduct. A broken agreement is still a broken agreement. The point isn't to make harmful conduct disappear into explanation. The point is to stop treating one visible behavior as proof of a personality disorder diagnosis. Now let's bring you back a moment and compare four possible functions. First, consider narcissistic injury and self-worth regulation. Vecnin proposes that outside regulation in the narcissistic pattern supports self-worth, self-concept, grandiosity, and the inner processes that keep those things active. In other words, outside input may be holding up a person's special self-image, not merely providing pleasant attention. Bakhtin points out that narcissistic injury is a threat to grandiosity, such as criticism or feedback that contradicts specialness. What could that mean when you're the one setting the limit? You say, I need, I need to rest. Within this hypothetical pattern, the other person may experience your limit as injury, demotion, or loss of expected regulation. The private meaning might be, how can you place your need above me? The possible function of the response would be to restore admiration, control, or the expected regulatory role. Possible observable reactions include contempt, counterattack, or withdrawal, but none is unique to narcissistic personality disorder and none proves the underlying function. The other person might say, you're selfish, punish you with silence, or attack the legitimacy of your exhaustion. But someone else could do the same thing for an entirely different reason, so the behavior doesn't close the question. It opens a careful one. The question could be this: what might this response repeatedly be trying to restore? Second, consider perceived abandonment and intensity regulation. Vectin proposes that borderline external regulation concerns the intensity of already active emotions, moods, thoughts, and feelings. In other words, the possible issue here isn't primarily specialness. The other person may already feel flooded with emotion, and contact with you may have become part of how the other person settles that intensity. In a possible borderline pattern, the other person may experience your limit as abandonment or rejection, feel intense fear or anger, and urgently try to restore contact. Okay, just as a reminder, this is a hypothetical explanation, not a diagnosis. What could that look like? That could look like repeated messages, anger, a sudden demand for reassurance, a rapid movement from, please don't leave me, to, I never want to see you again. The emotional movement may occur during dysregulation and may still be harmful or coercive. The last part is essential. An emotion can be sincere and overwhelming, while the resulting behavior pressures you to give up your boundary. Explaining the behavior does not remove accountability. Third, consider salience and attention regulation. Vecnin describes histrionic functioning as a pattern in which the person seeks attention, feels uncomfortable outside the center of attention, and externalizes emotion through performance. In other words, when the person isn't the center of attention, the person becomes uncomfortable and feels compelled to regain that attention. Salience simply means becoming the focus again. So let's imagine this. When you step back from the evening, the other person may feel less visible. The possible function of a larger emotional display would be to restore attention and centrality. The other person may want to become salient again. Maybe the distress becomes louder. Maybe the emotional expression becomes more theatrical or your attention as your attention moves away. In that pattern, the other person may become more theatrical or intensify emotional expression after losing your attention. I'm not saying this establishes histrionic personality disorder. Intensity isn't proof of deception. Theatrical expression doesn't prove that the other person feels nothing. The other person can sincerely experience emotion through a highly visible display and still express that emotion in a way that humiliates, pressures, or overwhelms you. Fourth, what about instrumental psychopathy? Vecnin says psychopathic conduct is goal oriented and potentially ruthless or callous in pursuit of an objective. Instrumental objectification may end once the person gets what they want. In other words, the central question isn't, how do I restore specialness? What they're asking is, how do I stop feeling this rejection? It may be, can you still help me get what I want? Within this contrast, one possible psychopathic pattern could be tactical recalculation about utility, access, or leverage after you hold your limit. For example, you might observe the other person bargaining, seeking another route to the goal, or disengaging when the other person can no longer reach the goal. Quick reminder, these behaviors are not specific to psychopathy. The other person might offer you something or pressure a different route or contact someone else or simply leave when you no longer appear useful. But bargaining isn't proof of psychopathy. Disengagement isn't proof of psychopathy. We are comparing possible functions, not handing out diagnostic shortcuts. Also, psychopathy isn't a separate diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That manual diagnoses antisocial personality disorder, while psychopathy is a related but debated concept. We shouldn't treat the two as interchangeable. One reaction to your limit can't establish narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, or antisocial personality disorder, and it can't establish psychopathy. So, what have we actually learned from this comparison? The visible protest may look selfish in all four versions of behaviors, but one person may be trying to restore threatened grandiosity and self worth. Another may be trying to stop perceived abandonment and overwhelming emotional intensity. Another may be trying to regain your attention. Another may be calculating whether you still provide access to a goal. And the fifth response may have no personality disorder explanation at all. The comparison doesn't tell you which story is true. It teaches you why certainty from behavior alone is unsafe. The more useful move is to keep observing the pattern and the consequence. And with that, we can talk about accountability. The book Oweleni advises us not to assume we're entitled even to another person's attention. It says to check for consent instead. The book Oweleni also brings clear boundaries together with separate needs, personal accountability, and responsibility for your own emotional well being while still allowing people to offer each other consistency and support. You can care about another person's fear, shame, disappointment, or distress without granting unlimited access. Support doesn't require outsourced personhood. Compassion doesn't require you to become the only regulator, the permanent audience, the supplier of specialness, or the route to somebody else's goal. Expectation management is another important section in the book, Oelani. The book says to be direct and clear about who you are and what you're willing to do and provide. Johnny Soporno adds that people should communicate what others can expect, update them when intentions change, and distinguish an expectation from an actual commitment. Someone else's disappointment does not by itself create an obligation. Accountability arises when a person made a commitment and failed to live up to it. In other words, if you broke a real commitment, you should own that breach and pursue repair. If there was no commitment and you communicated a limit, another person's disappointment doesn't automatically cancel your autonomy. It's also important to point out that legal duties, caregiving duties, responsibilities tied to a position of trust, and other obligations created by the situation remain separate from this principle. Understanding a possible function doesn't excuse harmful conduct or require you to surrender your boundary. You can make relationship decisions based on repeated conduct, consequences, responsibility, repair, and safety, even when motive and diagnosis remain unknown. So, what do you do with this information? Choose one recurring behavior that has confused you, not the most dramatic event in isolation, one behavior that actually repeats. Put it in a journal or notes app and ask 4 questions. First question, what happened before it? Stay with what you could have recorded. You set a limit, you moved your attention elsewhere, you changed a plan, you gave feedback, you expected someone to honor an agreement. Second question, what might the behavior have been trying to obtain or prevent? Use more than one possible answer. Maybe contact, maybe attention, maybe control, maybe restoration of threatened specialness, maybe access to a goal. Very important, keep the word maybe. Function is still an inference. Third question, what happened when the boundary or consequence remained? Did the other person negotiate respectfully? Did the pressure intensify? Did the story change? Did repair become possible? Did the other person accept responsibility? Did you become less safe? Fourth question, what repeated across time and contexts? This is where confusion starts becoming usable information. You aren't proving a diagnosis, you're learning whether the other person repeated conduct supports trust, whether agreements mean anything, whether repair occurs, and what level of access is safe. A personality disorder label alone does not determine an individual's risk. If safety is a concern, focus on concrete behaviors and circumstances, especially current or past violence, threats, substance use, current stressors, and relevant history, and see qualified risk assessment when needed. Don't provoke anyone to see what happens. Don't test a person. Don't confront someone with a label. Observe what already occurs, protect your boundary you actually need, and respond to concrete behavior. Let's return to the beginning of the episode. You say, I can't do tonight, I need to rest. The response may tell you something important, but it won't by itself tell you the diagnosis or private function. What you can learn is whether the other person respects your limit, whether harm repeats, whether the other person takes responsibility, whether repair is real, and whether continued access is safe. You don't need to solve another person's mind before you believe the pattern isn't before you believe the pattern in front of you. Thanks for watching this episode. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Tell me how comfort learn your name, where the silence means safety, or someone went away. Tell me what love looked like before it looked like me. I keep reaching for the outline, but I want the thing I see. Where your body closes, where your hope begins. I'm learning the weather under your skin. I don't want the person I invented in the dark. I want your particularities, every strange and living part. I want your particularities, not the ache, not the mask. I want the way you open and the shape of what you ask. Tell me what you carry when the world felt cold, what you never say out loud, what you only hold. Tell me how you hear me when my words come out wrong. What kind of touch is easy, what kind of touch is gone. Where your body closes, where your hope begins. I'm learning the weather under your skin. I don't want the person I invented in the dark. I want your particularities, every strange and living part. I want your particularities, not the ache, not the mask. I want the way you open and the shape of what you ask. If I love you, let me learn you, slow and true and bare, the map of every caution, the names of what you fear. If I love you, let me meet you, new each day, each time. Not a borrowed little fantasy, but the real shape of your life. I don't want the person I